Okay, so let's get straight into it then. Let's just start with the factors that affect aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So for AD, your equation is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. The reason I'm starting with this is that whenever in macroeconomics you're looking for causes or effects, in terms of causes, try to understand if one of the factors of aggregate demand changed. Because if aggregate demand changed, then your measures of macro performance will change, and that could have been a cause.
Okay.
Likewise, if you're looking for effect, if you know that this given thing affects aggregate demand, then you can say that one effect is an increase or a decrease in aggregate demand, and therefore this would cause a change in growth or inflation or unemployment or so on and so on. So the factors that affect aggregate demand are the equation C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C is consumer spending, G is government spending, I is business spending on capital goods. That's the one that most people kind of mix up. So investment sounds like, oh, you're investing in stocks and shares. No, it's investment, it's business spending on capital goods. Okay. And then we're just looking out for sub factors that affect any of these things. So for consumer spending, C, you've got things like incomes, confidence, and interest rates. For investment, you're looking out for things like business confidence, interest rates, and business profits. For government spending, G, you're looking out for things like the state of the economy, or the state of the economic cycle, or yeah, pretty much them two. And then for net exports, you're looking out for things like the exchange rate and inflation rates in our country or in other countries. Does that kind of make sense so far? Cool. So I would definitely test yourself later on and make sure you know the sub factors that affect C and I and G and X minus M, just so you know what to look out for in different questions. One more time before I move on. Consumer spending, you're looking out for things like interest rates and consumer confidence and incomes. Investment, you're looking out for things like business confidence, interest rates, and business profits. Government spending, you're looking out for the state of the economy or whether or not we have to cut national debt. And then for net trade, we're looking out for things like exchange rates. SRAS in particular, we're just looking out for any costs of production. Any change in any cost of production will cause a shift in the SRAS curve. These are things like raw material prices, wage rates, productivity, exchange rates, that kind of thing. Anything that makes a firm's costs increase or anything that makes a firm's costs decrease, but obviously that across the entire economy. So energy prices, for example, very random, but will affect all firms' costs in the economy. Finally, LRAS. So LRAS is long run aggregate supply, and it is affected by a few different things. The quality or the quantity of factors of production. Remember, your factors of production are capital, enterprise, land, labor. So these are affected by supply side policies as a whole. Generally, supply side policies will look to increase incentives that allow people to work harder or encourage people to work harder or encourage businesses to invest more, as well as just outright quality of infrastructure and education and training and mobility and stuff like that. So it's kind of more generic, but specifically factors of production, specifically quality, quantity, specifically incentives. But as a whole, you're looking out for supply side policies. Next, we're going to look at the macroeconomic objectives. So the first one that comes to mind is inflation. Inflation is when there's an increase in average price level. Deflation is when there's a decrease in the average price level. Disinflation is when there's a decrease in the rate of inflation. So, for example, from 2% to 1%, or from 5% to 2%.
Mm.
Inflation we have a target of a low and stable inflation, so that can be like 1 or 2%. The reason that's important is to prevent very, very high inflation. That is awful. And we also want to prevent deflation, which is also awful, if not even worse than awful. Now, the reason high inflation is bad is due to it being able to trigger a wage price spiral. A wage price spiral happens when high prices increase cost of living. This prompts workers around the economy to bargain for higher wages. This leads to firms having to provide higher wages, therefore having higher costs. This leads to them increasing prices even further, which reinforces the cycle that people will ask for higher wages. During this spiral, whilst it's happening, some of these people who are bargaining for higher wages will easily get their pay increases. Other people won't get their pay increases because they have low bargaining power. So this can cause some workers to be left behind, which widens the gap, like inequality, and widens the gap in quality of life between different people.
Okay.
It doesn't mean things like, so a common misconception with inflation is that it causes people to stop spending. It's not that they will stop spending, they have to keep spending. They just have less money to do so.
Okay.
They can't really afford to save actually, because they have to pay their bills, they have to buy food, they have to spend some of their money to go out and stuff, right?
Yeah.
Deflation, on the other hand, does do that. Deflation means that people will stop spending. Why? Deflation is when there's a fall in prices. So if a university degree or a course or a car or a house, if that's about to become cheaper, you're likely to wait for it to become cheaper. But when you get to that time, prices still seem to be on the way down. You're going to wait more and wait more and wait more. This causes a fall in aggregate demand. This causes unemployment. This is a deflationary spiral because that causes even more deflation, which reinforces that cycle, the deflationary spiral. Inflation is measured by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. It tracks the prices of a basket of household goods, around 300 goods, every month. So, for example, in June 2026, we might compare the prices of that basket of goods compared to June 2025. And then in July 2026, we'll compare it to July 2025 and just see how much that basket changed in price in the last 12 months. That basket can get updated if some things become more popular or less popular.
Okay.
Moving on to economic growth. Economic growth is when there's an increase in real GDP. The important thing here is to make sure you know the difference between short-run economic growth versus long-run economic growth, or in Excel, the words would be actual economic growth versus potential growth. So this is your actual economic growth, and then potential growth refers to an increase in LRAS, or an increase in the productive potential of the economy.
Okay.
The important thing here is that when you're considering the trade-offs and when you're considering how to achieve them, everything changes. In terms of increasing real GDP and increasing actual economic growth, you just need to use demand-side policies. And there's a clear trade-off that when you do more actual economic growth, when the economy grows more and more, there is likely to be inflation, right? Because aggregate demand will increase, right? But when LRAS increases, inflation does not go up. So there are no trade-offs here.
Okay.
Whilst we're talking about economic growth, it's also worth knowing the difference between a positive and a negative output gap. So if I was to quickly draw an economic cycle, the straight line is showing the trend rate of growth and the curved line is showing the actual rate of growth. So every time the actual rate of economic growth is bigger than the trend rate of economic growth, there is a positive output gap. And every time the economy is growing slower than the trend rate of economic growth, there's a negative output gap.
Okay.
A negative output gap has things like spare capacity and unemployment and wasted factors of production. A positive output gap is associated with things like inflation. Think of it as the macro version. A positive output gap is the macro version of excess demand, and a negative output gap is the macro version of excess supply.
Yeah.
Unemployment. The main thing here is just to remember that there are a few types of different unemployment, but the main two that are really, really important are cyclical unemployment and structural unemployment. When I say more important for big questions, because those are the ones that you would need to distinguish between, but for short questions, make sure you know all of them: frictional and seasonal and real wage unemployment as well. But for big questions, cyclical unemployment is when there's a lack of aggregate demand across the entire economy. So this happens during a recession, this happened during COVID, and so on and so on. Structural unemployment is specifically to do with one or two industries. When demand for that one industry is gone, meaning that those workers in that one industry have lost their jobs and they don't have the ability to get a new job, right? One example of that is the steel industry. It's now cheaper to import steel from China. Therefore, those who used to work in the steel industry lost their job. Structural unemployment should ideally not take too long to fix, but it will do. That's because of issues like geographical immobility of labor. Those who worked in the steel industry, those were the only jobs in that given area. They can't travel quickly or relocate to a new area where there's different jobs.
Wait, can you repeat cyclical?
And structural unemployment, the other issue is occupational immobility of labor, which is when workers can't retrain and get a new set of skills. Yeah. So just to recap, cyclical unemployment is when there's a lack of aggregate demand in the economy. It happens during a recession. It basically affects everybody.
Yeah.
Structural unemployment only affects one specific industry, such as the steel industry.
Okay.
For example, when the robo-taxis come out, taxi drivers will be the only people affected by that. They would then need to be able to relocate or retrain to get more work. For example, if robo-taxis come in London, there should be enough geographical mobility of labour for them to move out of London or work outside of London. There should also be enough occupational mobility of labour for them to retrain and get new skills that are actually in demand. The other type, so frictional unemployment is just the workers who are without a job whilst they are moving between jobs.
Okay.
You won't get a big question on that, you'd get smaller questions. And seasonal unemployment is when there's a lack of demand for the worker during the different times of the year.
Yeah.
The current account, in terms of year 12, I wouldn't worry too much. It's just that it's X minus M.
Okay.
So when the current account improves, X minus M improves, meaning AD improves, and vice versa. The only thing that I can think of for year 12 that affects the current account is supply side policies. The better the supply side policies, the better the productivity, the lower the prices and costs are in this country. Therefore, our exports become more attractive. The only other thing I would say is exchange rates, but it's more year 13.
Okay.
These are the four main macro objectives, and there are other side objectives that are not maybe as important, but just worth considering. Reducing national debt is a big theme recently. Environmental protection is a smaller theme, but growing in importance, and inequality is another one. Inequality probably more so for year 13, but national debt is a big one. So national debt links to the budget deficit. It's the accumulation of budget deficits year on year on year on year. The budget deficit is the difference between government spending and taxation. So if government spending is higher than tax revenue, there would be a budget deficit. If this happens again and again, it's basically going to accumulate as debt. Debt is bad because the government have to repay it. When they repay it, they have to either increase taxes or cut spending, right? That would have to go up or that would have to go down. The other issue with national debt is interest. The UK government spent about £100 billion in the last couple of years, each year, just on interest. So there's an opportunity cost of having debt. If we had no debt, we wouldn't have to pay so much in interest, which would mean we actually have money left over to spend on nicer things.
Okay.
In terms of what you'd probably want to go over outside of this session is just definitions. For example, knowing the definition of real GDP, knowing the definitions of inflation, deflation, this aggregate demand and stuff like that. So I can send you a glossary for that on the side. It's definitely oversimplified, but for the most part, the first two are the things that are likely to come up in year 12. So let's just know 2 or 3 different policies to reduce unemployment or increase growth in the economy, and also 2 or 3 policies to reduce inflation in the economy. So just off the top of your head, what are the policies that can be used to increase economic growth? So let's just make sure we know what the policies are in the first place. So fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxation to influence aggregate demand in the economy.
Mhm.
So fiscal and monetary, both demand side policies, they both affect aggregate demand. So fiscal policy is the use of, so you can think of gin and tonic. It's the use of government spending and taxation to influence aggregate demand in the economy.
Okay.
Monetary policy is the use of interest rates to influence aggregate demand in the economy. So when I asked you, you correctly said that one way the government can increase economic growth is by reducing interest rates. That's spot on. The other
Yeah.
way is by reducing things like income taxes or by increasing spending in the economy. All of these things would lead to an increase in aggregate demand. The only
Yeah.
wild card I would say to remember is also to use supply side policies or to understand how they work and how they are different. So maybe we can go through an example in a minute.
Okay.
I'm going to take off the policies to reduce national debt. I don't think it would come up too much in year 12. What about policies to reduce inflation? And then I'm going to go through more chains of reasoning for these. Good. So one way to reduce inflation in the economy is to increase interest rates.
Yeah.
And another way is to either increase taxes or cut spending.
Okay.
Again, both of these would reduce aggregate demand in the economy. And again, a wild card, supply side policies. When you're fully revised and fully prepared for year 12, you should know supply side policies really, really well and the difference between the demand side and the supply side policies.
Okay.
Just for context, demand side policies would lead to a shift in aggregate demand. So, for example, if you wanted to cut inflation, you would shift aggregate demand to the left. The downside here is, as you can see, economic growth is falling, right?
Yeah.
Vice versa, if you wanted to boost economic growth or reduce unemployment, you can reduce interest rates or you can increase government spending, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. This is good. Aggregate demand increases, but there's also a trade off with inflation. So the difference here is that when you use supply side policies, there's less of a trade off. Okay, so see here, there's an increase in economic growth from Y1 to Y2, and there's also a fall in inflation, which is something that we wouldn't have been able to achieve without without inflation using demand side policies.
Okay.
Do you understand the difference?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. What would you say are the main downsides of each of the policies then? So let's start with expansionary fiscal policy. Remind me what it is and then try to use it to think of a downside of that policy. Good.
Or
So,
like they reduced the
yeah,
tax.
correct. So expansionary fiscal is when the government increases spending or cuts taxes. This
Yeah.
is generally considered a good thing as it can lead to an increase in AD and therefore an increase in growth. The downside is national debt.
Yeah, because the government is spending more.
Exactly. As the government increases spending or cuts taxes, the budget deficit gets worse. This adds even more to the sum of national debt. And I explained the problems of national debt in terms of interest and opportunity costs and future generations having to suffer from tax hikes or spending cuts.
Okay. Yeah.
The downside of contractionary fiscal policy is that it can actually lead to, well, it can obviously lead to slower growth. So
Yeah.
currently the governments are trying to or having to cut spending or increase taxes. This means the economy is not quite growing as fast as it otherwise could have done. It also very heavily depends on what type of spending is cut or what type of spending are raised. Taxes are raised. Some taxes have specific implications on externalities. Some taxes have specific implications on inequality. So that's another thing to consider.
Okay. Yeah.
But generally, just any types of trade-offs you can think of. Expansionary monetary policy. You probably wouldn't know this one. It's the liquidity trap.
No.
This is the idea that, as you were saying earlier, lower interest rates in theory are meant to lead to a lower cost of borrowing and a lower reward for saving. This is meant to stimulate more borrowing and more spending. However, the issue is that sometimes lower interest rates may fail to stimulate the economy. This is because banks do not want to pass on lower interest rates to consumers during, for example, a recession. If you think about it, the Bank of England offer lower base rates to high street banks. High street banks may not want to pass this on to every consumer. For example, they might be scared consumers are losing their jobs or have lost their jobs, or the economy is too unstable to be giving out mortgages and giving out big loans, especially given what happened in the financial crisis. Okay, but again, I wouldn't rush and learn it in one quick second. I definitely spend some time on it when you have a chance. Contractionary monetary policy, I would say similar. Subtle changes. They're never going to increase interest rates by like 20%. So, for example, if you increase interest rates by 0.1%, even 0.5%, some people are unlikely to change their behavior just because of a small change in interest rates. So you can say there's a big like dependency on consumer confidence, business confidence, and how much interest rates are raised by. Therefore, if the economy is doing extremely well, maybe too well, increase in interest rates would not cause people to stop spending and start saving because people are very secure and they have good jobs.
Yeah.
And banks are also happy to pass on loans at lower rates, right?
Yeah.
When there's confidence and stability in the economy. The downside of supply side policies, I should have actually gone through the types first, but the downsides are almost always opportunity cost and time lag. The clear example is HS2. HS2 has a cost so far of £40 billion, and the time lag is running and running and running. It's still not done, so it's more than 10 years.
Yeah, it's like 2026 or something. 2046 now, so.
Yeah, they're not going to complete it in full anyway, which is... but anyway, the point is that's a good example. Just the different types of supply side policies. So you've got decreased income taxes, decreased corporation taxes, and then you've got spending on infrastructure, and you've got spending on education. And with any of these, LRAS will shift to the right as I showed you in that other diagram. Okay. The idea behind infrastructure, better transport links and better infrastructure will lead to more productivity, so LRAS will shift out. Better education and training will lead to more labour market mobility, more skills, and therefore more productivity, therefore LRAS will shift out. Decreasing income taxes will lead to more skilled workers being incentivized to work. People will be incentivized to take overtime or work harder or work longer to achieve promotions or pay rises as they're rewarded more for it. That increase in hard work will lead to more productivity and an increase in LRAS. Less corporation tax means businesses are more incentivized to set up in the given country, but even the businesses who already existed, they get to keep more of their profits, which means they can reinvest more in capital, and the more they invest in capital, productivity should increase, therefore LRAS should increase.
Okay.